Now, as it relates to retribution or blowback, because I'm sure you're aware, President Donald Trump just recently added a terrorist designation to the cartels. Do you think that's going to change anything as far as how these guys operate? Do you think it's going to get to the point where their backs are pushed against the wall to where even though they're not allowed to go against the U.S. or harm U.S. personnel, that might change? How do you see that playing out? What's going on, folks? Welcome back to the channel. Today I have Pierre. How do you pronounce your last name?
Rossini.
Ross. That's Italian, correct?
Yes, sir.
Gotcha. And I wanted to bring him on, guys, because he has a lot of knowledge as it relates to all the different cartels out there, structures, so on and so forth. And I wanted to share his perspective with you guys. So, Pierre, if you don't mind, just take a brief second to let the people know exactly who you are, what you've been through, and then we'll jump right into the first question.
Well, my name is Pierre Rossini. I was prosecuted under the federal drug kingpin statute for operating what the government characterized as a criminal enterprise. I spent over 2 decades in prison for various drug offenses, government, large-scale drug activity, quite frankly. And being from Los Angeles, a number of the individuals that were involved in the underlying drug conspiracies were key operatives within the Sinaloa structure. And so it gave me an opportunity to not only develop relationships with the men on the street, but once I came to prison, I was kind of accepted within their community only because the men that I knew were of sufficient horsepower, where they were like, yeah, you're all right, come on in. And so I've had an opportunity to live with the guys for 2 decades. I ate with the men every day. I interacted with them, watched 1,000 soccer games. And so, you get to develop an understanding on how they live, how they think, how they approach their problems, how they view themselves, quite frankly, how they view the American government. And so it really gives you an opportunity to understand why they were able to do what they do, which is essentially, for the past 35 years, you've got this collection of organizations led by men with second, third, and fourth grade educations that have managed to succeed within their scope, despite the American government having spent hundreds of billions of dollars targeting them. And so I always thought that it would be interesting to be able to share it with other individuals that there is a reason why they're able to function. And the issue generally is stemming from a fundamental misapprehension by not just our leaders, but quite frankly, the media and the law enforcement community on how the operations are structured.
Gotcha. Now, you mentioned earlier when we were speaking that a lot of people think there's only one cartel. I'm ignorant to that shit myself, right? Like, I made that mistake. What's the difference between all the different cartels out there? Sinaloa, Jalisco. What's the biggest difference between those ones?
Well, those are the 2 largest. And when we say 2 largest, we're talking as of about a year ago. Last summer, there was a civil war that erupted within the Sinaloa structure. And quite frankly, it's disarticulated. You've had one of the main groups have left. So for the first time since the early 90s, Sinaloa doesn't even have a presence on the south of the Arizona border. And until this civil war gets resolved, basically the Sinaloa cartel no longer exists.
Civil war between who exactly? Just the 2 different, leaders trying to take control of that organization?
No, there was a betrayal where Joaquin Guzman, El Chapo, who's currently serving a life sentence at federal prison at ADX in Colorado, his sons took over the operation, his organization. The cartel is a collection of organizations. Most of them are just family structures. And so Joaquin Guzman was never the head of the Sinaloa cartel. He was always the head of the Guzman organization, which was one of 44 organizations within that structure. Well, there were factions where there's collections of organizations that are aligned with different groups. So last summer, one of the sons of Joaquin Guzman, El Chapo, kidnapped the leader of the other main faction, brought him to the United States in connection with the cooperation effort. And so now he's essentially betrayed a gentleman named Ismail Zambada, known as El Mayo. So they betrayed Mayo to get one of the other Guzman sons a larger sentence reduction. So, of course, this precipitated a war between the two factions, and it's actually creating a diplomatic problem for the United States, because the United States and Mexico have an understanding that our government's not supposed to be participating in kidnapping their citizens. And Zambada has gone public saying, hey, he was kidnapped, and he's alleging that it was at the behest of the authorities here in the United States. We don't know what, that still hasn't been clarified. The U.S. government has formally taken the position that they weren't involved. And, we'll see how that plays out in court. But that, of course, precipitated the war, which you have to understand, there's a generational shift that happened about 5 or 6 years ago. The guys that started these operations, and this is, the first full year of Sinaloa's operation was 1990. It was formed in 1989. Well, those men today are in their 60s or 70s. And so when Joaquin Guzman was charged in 2016, if you take a look at his indictment, the word fentanyl doesn't even appear on there. And when I say fentanyl, I'm saying the synthetic opioid. I just don't want to say it because I don't want to get you struck. But the 2 years later, that's the first word in their son's indictment. And so the older men, the wiser heads, have always taken the position, do not undertake any course of action that's going to awaken the slumbering giant.
That being the United States.
That'd be the United States government. And unfortunately, the younger guys, or the newer generation, weren't around in the 1980s, the last time the giant was awakened. And so they're going to learn the same lesson that the older guys had to learn through going through that experience.
What do you think that lesson's going to look like? What do you think that's going to be in the form of, if you had to speculate?
I think, well, it's pretty informed speculation. The Mexican government is ultimately going to betray the Guzman faction, simply because they're the faction within the Sinaloa structure that went all in on fentanyl. And part of the problem that we have, it's a game theoretic issue, because when one group goes all in on a new compound that's much more lucrative than the others, the opposing groups have to participate. Otherwise, the one group gathers too much power. So it becomes like a race to the bottom, where everybody's acting in their short-term benefit at the expense of their long-term survival. And so there's a very good chance that you're going to see several of the groups that are essentially sacrificial lambs, where Mr. Trump, I'm convinced, is trying to get back to the status quo ante 2015, where there'll be no fentanyl, and just let the men go about whatever they're doing. Do your coke, do your crystal. But if you can get back to that particular status quo ante, he's saving 80 to 90,000 lives a year. I mean, it'd be an enormous achievement for Mr. Trump. Absolutely.
Because I'll revert back to this statement, because I'm like, dude, let's just be honest with each other. Americans are not going to stop doing drugs. Talking to you here, the folks watching this on YouTube, Americans are not going to stop doing drugs, right? It is what it is. But taking out all the synthesized stuff, can alleviate folks passing away, right? I had I had a leader that I served with in the military that his daughter passed away from this stuff, right? Didn't find her several days later. So wow. I've had personal experience with this. Now, as far as the structure itself, because I'm trying to wrap my head around this, right? Because, I know you're familiar with the military. So regardless of what unit you're in the military, right, there's always somebody in charge of you. And it goes all the way up to the commander in chief, right? So even, you have the Department of Defense, the SecDef is there. You got all the generals and you have everybody that serves under them. You mentioned 44 different organizations, or 74 different, or 44 different factors. Like, who's in charge of everybody? Who tells everybody, hey, fucking do this or else? Or do they all operate independently? Because if one faction is using is making their product harmful, shouldn't there be like an overall dude, like almost like a godfather type figure that comes down on that one specific faction, so everyone else can go about their business, or is it not structured that way?
For Sinaloa, no, it's not. It's not hierarchical in nature. It's always been horizontal, only because they're so far from the border. They didn't have the same structures that the other groups did. And so it became, the reason why it's so resilient is it's essentially operates like a flock of birds. They all move in unison, but there's no one bird in charge. It becomes the coordinated activity is an emergent property given the structure of the way they lay out the operation. And so you'll have 44 leaders. These aren't the knights at a round table. They're not all sitting at the same table. Like the guy in the first group may have a tie to the guy in the second group, and they'll have no ties to the guy in the 15th group, but there are interlocking chains in between them all of them. And so it's a coordination issue. They can't coordinate together because there is no particular individual in charge. Now, it's different with Jalisco because Jalisco is a top-down organization, and they all take their orders from Mencho. That's why I said earlier that the structure in Mexico is fundamentally different because they conquer territory, because they're essentially a paramilitary group that got involved in trafficking, whereas Sinaloa is a group of traffickers that built the paramilitary group. So it's a very different mindset between the two organizations. As for the other 7, look, I don't have any particular insight into those groups, only because if you're from Southern California, you've got nothing to do with the guys in Texas. Likewise, the guys that are operating in Houston, they've got nothing to do with the guys in LA. You're talking over there, it's Gulf Cartel guys, Northeast Cartel guys, Juarez Cartel guys. And so those are just completely different operations. Now, what I can tell you is they were all located up on the border. And so when you're right nestled up against the border, it's basically just picking money up off the floor. And so their operations tended to be not less sophisticated, but less complicated than Sinaloa's. And that ultimately would prove to be their strength, because although they were much farther from the border than the other groups, they had control over the primary tourist destinations, which became a money laundering cash cow. And their territory includes the 2 largest ports in Mexico on the West Coast. So those are strategic assets that the other groups can't match. Because if you're south of the Sonora Desert, they're not bringing in ships. So the advantages ultimately played out in Sinaloa's favor. But at the beginning, there was a period there, late 1990s, where they're on their last legs. They were damn near wiped out. And that's where they take their pride in their cleverness, because they were able to manipulate the American government into decapitating their rivals. And so when you hear them, when you have an opportunity to talk to one of these guys, some of the older guys, they'll always tell you, look, Uncle Sam saved them twice from extinction. And so for their perspective, they're not going to be the ones to start any military action.
Yeah. But they're also, because the more I think about it, I'm like, man, if shit ever gets out of hand, because my biggest thing has always been retribution. Now, if for whatever reason things get out of hand, do you see any escalation of any sorts? Because I'm sure you're aware that President Donald Trump assigned the terrorist designation to the cartels. Now, do you see that going anywhere?
I think the FTO designation is not really going to impact their operations in Mexico, because in Mexico, if these guys get apprehended, they're already all looking at 4 life sentences on the importation conspiracies, distribution conspiracies, the criminal enterprise conspiracies, the foreign drug kingpin act conspiracies. So whether it's 4 life sentences or 5 life sentences, that's not material. And there's a very famous saying within the Mexican trafficking community, another stripe for the tiger. Like, it doesn't really matter. No one's going to say, well, that 5th life sentence is unreasonable. I'd have just taken the first 4. And so once you adopt the another stripe for the tiger mentality, it indicates that it's not going to affect their operations down south. Here in the United States, it has the potential to act profoundly, depending on how our government plays its cards. Now, with respect to blowback, my concern is there are opportunities for escalation if we don't identify a clear path for them to satisfy Mr. Trump's demand. And so, for instance, let's say you've got 2 kids, your oldest boy and your youngest boy. You leave to go to work, you tell your sons, hey, make sure your bedroom's clean when I come home. Well, if you come home and your youngest son's room is nice and tidy and the older one's is a mess, what happens if you punish the younger son? Then he decides, you know what, I'm just not going to clean it. I'm going to get punished no matter what. So you have to be able to give a clear guidance. And obviously, there are back channel communications. There are any number of ways to get word to people. Because if the Sinaloa cartel, which is, I got this for your audience here, it's a 44 organization structure. Well, if this 44 organization group gets together and says, hey, we're done producing fentanyl. Well, there are over 500 other organizations in Mexico. They have no say over those other operations. Are they going to be blamed for individuals that they have no authority over? And if you put people in a position, well then, like the youngest son, if they're going to get blamed for something that they're not responsible for, then you're basically putting their back up against the wall. And when you put anyone's back up against the wall, you got to watch out, because people are going to do whatever they have to do to try to gain leverage over the situation, to change the dynamics between the parties. And so I think that the foreign terrorist organization designation is really a shot at the Mexican government, because the cartels are able to operate because they operate with impunity. At a minimum, there are elements of the Mexican government that have given them tacit approval to operate, if not express approval. And the FTO designation really puts the Mexican politician at risk. The traffickers are already all looking at life sentences. It's the guys that are getting the $50, $60, $70 million bribes that are political elite, military elite, law enforcement elite, because that's going to, I believe, give Mr. Trump the leverage to be able to say, look, either you shut this down, the fentanyl, otherwise we're going to start bringing actions against Mexican military personnel or governmental personnel, because they have a lot to lose. The guys living in the mountains, they're already dodging, their enemies trying to unalive them, the government trying to unalive them. The politicians are the individuals that are really at risk. The protection market that was created in 2007 is what, at its core, created the circumstances we find ourselves in. Because when the cartels make their decisions, they're doing so within the strategic landscape that our country creates. And so when we came up with the kingpin strategy that our lackeys in the Mexican government adopted in 2007, well, that was a great strategy if we're working with Switzerland or if we're working with Norway. See, this is the problem with the guys that went to the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. They're acting as if their plans are going to be implemented by a good faith partner in Mexico. Where instead, the guys in Mexico, they saw this as an opportunity to extract bigger rents. And so now it went from being $1 million or a $500,000 bribe. Now these guys are coming in demanding $50, $60, $70 million chips. Well, they got to, that's an enormous expense. Well, they have to raise revenue. So that's what you saw in 2008, the pivot to synthetics. And this isn't just me talking, because we actually have the cables from the State Department from Mexico up to Washington, because WikiLeaks released them. So I got it run. One of them right here is this cable called from 2008 called Chemical City, a 500% explosion in 1 year in meth production. Well, why did they pivot to meth? Because they're making a 900% return on investment rather than the 200% on the coke. So you had a 17-year period where there was an equilibrium. They would engage in their activity with the coke. When they get apprehended, they go to prison in Mexico. Well, we changed the rules. If you get caught after 2007, you're coming to the United States, you're doing a life sentence at 80x. So now they had to be able to raise the capital, because they don't see themselves as the predators. They see themselves as the prey. When they first came together, it wasn't because they wanted to exert dominance. Think of it as NATO. It's a defensive pact. It's not a commercial pact. They were the weakest of the groups. They formed an alliance to withstand the assaults from other groups and from the Mexican government. Now, as a secondary benefit, it allowed them to operate with greater economies of scale. They had division of responsibilities. So when you had the first 7 organizations come together, one of them handled the Colombians. Then once the product got to Mexico, one of them got it from Acapulco to the border. Then another group handled the payoffs. Then another group got it across the border. Then 2 other groups handled distribution. Well, that was all 7 groups. They just coordinated. And so that was the foundation that they built upon. Well, that worked for the first 17 years. Yes, they expanded. They added the regional distribution hubs east of the Mississippi. They added one in Denver. They added one in Phoenix. But they operate out of 6 venues in the United States. Now, what happened in 2007 is once the Kingpin strategy took effect, which the American government conceived based on the success they were having in Iraq with decapitation strikes. The year before, they took out a scumbag named Zarqawi. So they essentially took that model and said, we're going to apply it in the narco context. But in order for us to effectuate that strategy, it requires us to have a good faith partner in Mexico. Well, instead of the partners acting in good faith, they go to Sinaloa and say, hey, for $50 million, I can run interference for you. I'll feed them disinformation. I'll put them on your ops. And I'll compromise their investigations by leaking stuff to you. And so they ended up just starting to, the protection market that was created unintentionally as a result of American policy has really created the problems we're in today. Basically, the biggest beneficiary of the fentanyl crisis in the United States have been Mexican politicians and corrupt political and military elites.
Now, if for whatever reason this doesn't change, right? Because again, to your point, if one organization gives it up, who's to say another one, a smaller one that's up and coming, who's to say they won't pick up that production now, right? Because we went into Afghanistan because that country was harboring Osama bin Laden, essentially terrorism, dudes that came into the U.S. and committed these acts, right? So that prompted us to go into Afghanistan. If things don't change in Mexico for whatever reason, and this keeps on being a crisis, do you see any scenarios where we as the United States go into Mexico, essentially invade like we did in Afghanistan to combat cartel members essentially on their own turf to try to fix this synthetic coke situation?
The economics of the narco world have changed because when they went from the coke, which is a 200% return, to the crystal, which is a 900% return, now the fentanyl is 2,400% return. Well, for the first time, the economics in Mexico support operating independently of any cartel structure. Today, the majority of organizations in Mexico are not part of any cartel. Well, that creates a much more complicated situation because even if the 6 cartels that have been designated agree, well, there are still cartels that haven't been designated. And you still got hundreds of organizations that are completely outside of their control at all. Like, essentially, are we going to deputize them to go get the other people in line? Because short of us doing something like that, it's going to create a problem because we're not going to get the results that we want. And so that can prompt Mr. Trump to, of course, pressure the Mexican government. As far as targeted strikes, I mean, look, they're very good at hiding. You're not going to, unless you actually catch them, and they're just going to blend in with civilian society. Now, in the event you corner them, of course, they're going to do something. In the event key leaders or critical infrastructure get taken out, they may try to take a shot across the bow. But, they understand that, one, they are the much weaker of the two.
Mm-hmm.
Because quite frankly, they can't even outfight the Mexican government. Their biggest weapon are corrupt Mexican politicians. That's their shield. They hide behind that.
Yeah, and I think the only way we're going to fix this is by taking those corrupt politicians
Yes.
and essentially fighting them through Mexico without putting soldiers on the actual ground. So should be pretty interesting. We'll see how things develop. And this last question is for you, Pierre, and then I'll wrap this one up. Now, as far as fentanyl itself, no, let's skip that one. Let me find a good one to end this one with. All right, we'll go this one. What's your opinion on legalization? All right, we'll go through this next one up here, and then we'll wrap this one up. What's your opinion on the idea of legalizing drugs as a way to cripple the cartel? Would that even work?
Look, the at its core, the issue is always one of profits. And if you undermine the profit structure, you disincentivize. See, we're not aligning our incentives with what we want the adversary to do. And so oftentimes our actions are counterproductive. And so when the American government attacked the Colombian infrastructure in the early 80s, well, if you stop and think about it, they exercised monopoly power. They were an actual cartel. Well, a monopoly is always going to do what monopolists do. They're going to artificially inflate the prices by restricting supply. Well, aren't those the people you want in charge? They're restricting the supply. Instead, we attack that infrastructure by intercepting their flights. The more planes that you intercept, now you're incentivizing them to do what? To scale up production. So in 1982, there was 4 tons of coke coming to the United States every month for a total of 48 a year. 15 years later, there's 80 tons a month. You had a 20-fold increase. Reagan would have been better off just abolishing the DEA in 82 and burning $500 billion. It'd have been a more effective counter-narcotics strategy. And so to answer your question, so much of the calamity is driven by people not understanding how markets work and not understanding human nature. So every time penalties are increased, you make more traffickers. You abolish parole, you make more traffickers. Mandatory minimum, you've given them a raise. Nobody in Northern Hemisphere wants a wall built more than Mr. Trump than the cartel leaders. Because they are going to command an enormous risk premium. It's going to remove all the ham and egg operators who can't afford to construct $30 or $40 million importation cells. So the mom and pop guys are going to get out. So it's going to result in the big boys making more money. So if you want to undermine the market, as counterintuitive as it is, lower the penalties. Because if you lower the penalties, it's not going to become as lucrative as it currently is. Because there is no country in the United States there's no country on this planet with more stringent drug laws than China. They literally unalive thousands of traffickers every year. And yet, what country is host to the largest operation on the planet? China. China's operation is 3 times bigger than Sinaloa. Kongsi is enormous. Now, you don't hear about them here in the States, but they are certainly the largest. Sinaloa is the largest in the Western Hemisphere, not the largest in the world. And so, unaliving drug traffickers don't necessarily achieve the results you want because human nature, people bank on them not being the ones who get caught.
Mm-hmm.
And so, to answer your question, obviously, legalization is fraught with a lot of controversy, and it's a very emotionally charged issue. I tend to be much more libertarian. I'm on the spectrum, so I tend to see things a little bit more in black and white terms. And so if you look at it from an economics standpoint, anything you can do to lower the profit margin per unit is a net benefit. And so if you decide you're going to give life sentences for first-time offenders, that's an enormous raise for the Mexicans. Because they have no problem with every American trafficker getting a life sentence. They don't care. Because they make their money at the first stage, the first tier wholesale level sale. Whatever happens downstream doesn't impact them whatsoever.
And as long as there's a market for it, they're going to keep showing up at that first transaction and passing it on.
Well, the demand in the United States is, quite frankly, enormous. There's $150 billion last year, over $150 billion the year before. Like, there's more money spent on controlled substances than on alcohol. And so as long as there's this enormous demand, then, again, human nature. People celebrate. It's funny. People celebrate like 600 years ago as the age of exploration. It wasn't the age of exploration. Christopher Columbus wasn't an explorer. Christopher Columbus was a greedy businessman. He thought he could come up with a way to get a shorter trade route to the Indies. And if he was right, he was going to be richer than beyond his wildest dreams. He sold that dream to the Spanish monarchy. They agreed to bankroll the operation. Well, when he finally got the green light, he had to go raise a crew. Well, he had to explain to these men, look, it's going to be a dangerous mission. I'm putting my life on the line. He's not one of these guys that sends other people. He was on the boat. Well, he was able to persuade these men and saying, look, we're subjecting ourselves to a horrendous death at sea. He's thinking that the earth is round. Most people thought the earth was flat. They didn't know if they're going to sail right off the cliff. Despite not knowing where they're going, no rudders, no ledgers, not fancy ships like today. These are rickety-ass boats that leaked all the time, sank all the time, fell apart in storms. Every sailor knows the horrendous death at sea that awaits him. Despite having all of these factors weighing against the decision to say yes, every one of those men got on that rickety-ass boat. Why? Because it is human nature for men, in the face of overwhelming odds, to take a chance in order to be rich.
Absolutely.
And every trafficker knows the majority of them end up either dead or in prison. But it doesn't stop them from getting on that rickety-ass boat.
That's a good way to put it.
And so that's why you have to incorporate not only an understanding of economics, also the economics of the drug world, but also fundamental human nature. So long as you have literally millions of guys growing up in Mexico in dire poverty, they're going to keep getting on that boat because the people in the 21st century who get on the boats are the drug traffickers.
Mm-hmm.
And so
what's the alternative?
I'm not trying to romanticize the issue. I'm simply saying that this is just the reality of it.
Yeah.
That's how you get the situation in China with the largest operation on the planet. Every one of those men risked their lives on the off chance of being wealthy. Those that got caught get unalived by the government. The other ones are just banking on not getting caught.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Pierre, if anybody wants to reach out to you, where can they find you on social media wise?
Well, if they wanted to, they can contact me just through Instagram.
Awesome. Well, Pierre, I appreciate your time, man. Folks, if you have any feedback for us, please leave it in the comment section below. I'm sure as this development keeps on developing, I'll have Pierre on to share some more expertise, especially as we deal with Mexico and trying to fix this issue. I appreciate you guys watching. Until next time, folks, take care of yourself.